There is a 22-pound bag of beef sitting on my kitchen counter right now. I bought it this morning from an ordinary supermarket for $120. In most homes across this country, that same $120 only buys 4 steaks on a foam tray, enough for one dinner and nothing else. Out of this bag, I have already pulled 14 individual steaks, 1 roast big enough to feed 6 people on a Sunday, 3 pounds of trim set aside for burgers later in the week, and a small jar of rendered beef fat cooling on the back burner for tomorrow morning's breakfast. Same store, same money, 4 times the food. It did not require a coupon, a warehouse club membership, or a special trip to some hard-to-find butcher. Every single step I'm about to show you can be done in an ordinary kitchen, with the equipment already sitting in your drawers. A Japanese family buying the exact same steaks at the exact same grocery store saves hundreds of dollars off their monthly bill compared to the average American household. Not because the beef is cheaper where they shop, not because they have access to some special cut, but because of what happens to that beef once it walks through the front door. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 15 simple habits any home cook can start using this week that let a Japanese family cut their steak bill in half without changing where they shop or what they buy. We'll start with a single technique that changes everything else that follows. Move through the shopping secrets most Americans walk right past, and end with the freezer trick that turns one Sunday afternoon into an entire week of dinners. Habit 1. The cross-grain slice, the single largest source of savings in the entire Japanese approach to beef, has nothing to do with what steak you buy or where you buy it, and everything to do with what happens on the cutting board once it comes home. In households across Japan, a single steak is never treated as a single serving. The idea is simple. One thick American-style steak can comfortably feed 4 people if it's sliced properly. Once you've seen a steak served this way, the whole idea of 1 steak per person starts to look wasteful. Here's how it works. Take a piece of beef that would normally serve 1 person in 8-ounce slab and place it in the freezer for 20 to 30 minutes until it's firm on the outside but still slightly soft in the center. Cold beef is the whole trick. A soft steak at room temperature tears and smears under the knife. A firm, cold one cuts into clean, uniform ribbons that look like they came from a professional kitchen. If the meat starts to soften halfway through slicing, just pop it back in the freezer for 10 minutes and finish the job once it's firm again. Find the grain first. Look for the long parallel lines running through the muscle, then slice at a right angle to those lines, into pieces about the thickness of a coin. That single steak is now a small pile of tender ribbons that sear in a hot pan in under a minute per side. Every ribbon is more tender than the whole steak would have been, because cutting across the grain shortens the muscle fibers in every bite. That's the whole trick. This habit is especially valuable for cheaper cuts like skirt, flank, and hanger steak, all of which are pronounced grain and eat like leather if sliced the wrong way, but turn silky and tender when sliced correctly. Butchers know this. It's why professional Japanese cooks are taught the cross-grain cut on their very first day of training, long before they're trusted with anything else on the board. One knife matters more than any other tool in this whole process. A long, thin slicing knife glides through partially frozen beef without dragging, while a short chef's knife tends to compress the meat and tear the fibers instead of cutting them cleanly. You don't need to buy anything new. Most kitchens already have a bread knife or a carving knife tucked in a drawer that will do the job. Wipe the blade clean between cuts if you notice any tearing, and let the weight of the knife do the work instead of pressing down hard. Habit 2. Stretching one steak into 4 meals. Those thin, cross-grain slices are the raw material for an entire repertoire of Japanese beef dinners, from grilled meat over rice to a light hot pot for dipping, to strips wrapped around scallions and grilled over an open flame. Rice bowls make the clearest example. A dish that's fed working families for over a century uses only about 3 ounces of beef per portion, simmered briefly in a sweet, savory sauce of soy, mirin, and sugar, then served over a full cup of hot rice. A 12-ounce ribeye that costs about $22 and would feed 1.5 Americans as a plated meal, instead feeds 4 full-size rice bowls, dropping the cost per person from roughly $15 down to under $6. That sweet sauce actually deepens the beef's flavor as it simmers, so the meal often tastes more satisfying than a plain grilled steak on a plate ever did. A family that eats steak this way 3 nights a week saves close to $300 a month without ever changing what they buy at the supermarket. Nothing about the shopping list changes, only what happens to it afterward. Habit 3. Shopping the bottom shelf once every steak in your kitchen is going to be sliced into ribbons anyway. The shape and appearance of what you buy at the store becomes almost irrelevant. That opens up a part of the meat case most American shoppers walk past every single week. On the bottom shelf, there's usually a small plastic tray priced far below everything above it. It holds the small, irregular pieces trimmed away when the butcher cuts the neat, uniform slabs displayed at eye level. Same animal, same butcher, same morning. The only difference is the shape of the piece sitting in the tray. These end cuts show up under names like steak tips, beef trim, stir-fry beef, or discounted beef pieces. A pound of ribeye displayed as neat slabs might cost $22, while the same weight of the same ribeye sold as end cuts costs $8 or $9, a savings of close to $15 a pound on identical beef. Once every piece gets sliced into ribbons before it hits the pan, the difference in appearance disappears entirely on the plate. Nobody at your dinner table will ever know the difference, because there isn't one. Most stores restock that bottom tray early in the morning, right after the butchers finish the day's cutting, so a mid-morning trip tends to turn up more variety than an evening visit. If you don't see it out, it's worth asking the person behind the counter directly. Many stores keep a second batch in the back that never makes it to the case at all, especially on weekends when trimming volume is higher. A polite question costs nothing, and butchers are usually happy to point out where it's kept once they realize you actually want it. Habit 4. Reading the marbling. Not the label most people pick their steak by looking at the grade stamp choice or prime and paying whatever price matches. A smarter approach ignores the sticker almost entirely and reads the meat itself, looking for the finest, most evenly spread network of white fat lines running through the muscle. That marbling is where the flavor and tenderness actually live. American beef grading only examines one small spot on the carcass, so marbling can vary enormously between two steaks stamped with the same grade, sitting in the same case, cut that same morning. The one with tighter, more evenly distributed fat will taste like prime while costing you the price of choice. This habit costs nothing but an extra minute of looking, and it routinely hands you beef that tastes $10 a pound more expensive than what you paid for it. Habit 5. Timing the evening markdown somewhere between 6 and 8 p.m. in almost every large American grocery chain. Someone from the meat department walks through with a roll of yellow stickers and marks down every steak that won't sell before its date. The first round is usually 20% off. As closing time approaches, the same steaks drop to 30, then 40, sometimes 50% off. A ribeye that was $22 a pound at 3 p.m. can be $11 a pound by 8 p.m., the identical piece of beef, cut that same morning, just a few hours later on the clock. Shifting your weekly steak trip from a Saturday afternoon to a weeknight evening between 6 and 8 can save a household more than $200 a month without changing a single thing about what ends up in the cart. The best hour varies by store, so it's worth checking your local meat department once or twice around dinner time until you find the pattern. Habit 6. Outside skirt steak within any American meat case, there's a cut most shoppers walk straight past on their way to the ribeye. Outside skirt steak usually runs around $8 a pound, with a deep beefy flavor and an open grain that soaks up marinade fast and turns tender in minutes on a hot pan, rather than the hours most cheap cuts demand. It's sold at the meat case or ordered from the butcher counter, and it's worth asking for by name if you don't see it out. Habit 7. Denver steak sits at $7 to $9 a pound and is one of the most heavily marbled cuts in the entire store. Pound for pound, it delivers more of that fine white fat that makes beef taste like beef than almost anything else at that price. Larger warehouse clubs stock it regularly, often under that exact name, so it's usually easier to find than it sounds. Habit 8. Top blade steak rounds out the trio of cuts worth knowing. It eats somewhere between a steak and a rich pot roast, with a line of soft connective tissue running down the center that melts into the meat when it's cooked hot and fast in a very hot pan. It sits in the same $6 to $10 a pound range as the other two, while ribeye and strip steak from the same animal sell for $18 to $25. Switching a regular steak dinner to any of these three cuts saves roughly $12 a pound. A family eating steak twice a week ends up close to $200 a head by the end of the month, and most people find these cuts more interesting to eat than a plain ribeye once they know how to cook them. A few American butchers will still cut all three to order if you ask by name, even if they're not sitting out on display. Habit 9. Shio koji marinade cheap cuts only become worthwhile once they're handled properly, and shio koji is the first technique worth learning. It's a soft white paste of fermented rice, salt, and water, sold in the international aisle of most large supermarkets. Its natural enzymes break down tough proteins overnight. Spread a thin layer on both sides of the steak, seal it, and refrigerate for 6 to 24 hours. Wipe off the excess before searing. In a single $8 jar tenderizes dozens of steaks over the following months, one of the highest returns per dollar of any ingredient in the store. Habit 10. Grated onion marinade. A grated onion does nearly the same job for less than $1 per batch. Grate a whole yellow onion into pulp, mix it with soy sauce, mirin, a splash of sake, and grated ginger and garlic. Then pour the whole mixture over your steak in a sealed bag. 2 hours transforms tough chuck or flank. 4 hours makes it eat like filet. Before cooking, brush off the pulp and sear the beef as you normally would. Habit 11. Home dry aging costs nothing beyond the beef itself. Pat a steak at least 1.5 inches thick, completely dry, salt it lightly, wrap it loosely in fresh paper towels, and set it on a rack in the coldest part of your fridge. Change the towels once a day for 4 to 5 days, then trim off the dried outer layer at the end. What's left is beef that would cost $35 to $45 a pound at a specialty butcher for a fraction of the price and none of the drive. Home dry aging isn't identical to the 30-day process a steakhouse uses. Commercial aging rooms hold a precise humidity and airflow that a household fridge simply can't match, so the deep, funky character of a proper aged steak won't fully develop in 5 days. What you do get is a milder, cleaner version of that same effect, firmer texture, more concentrated flavor, and a slightly nutty finish that a fresh steak never has. For most home cooks, that's a fair trade for 5 days and $0 spent. Habit 12. Rendering beef tallow every steak comes with a rim of white fat most people throw away without a second thought. Collect those trimmings in a freezer container instead, and once you have enough, render them down into pure beef tallow. Simmer on the lowest heat for 2 to 3 hours with a splash of water to keep it from scorching. Strain through a fine mesh sieve, and you're left with a jar that keeps for months and replaces butter or oil in searing, roasting, and frying. Frozen in an ice cube tray, each cube holds roughly a tablespoon, exactly the amount needed to sear a single steak whenever you need it. Habit 13. Free bones. Homemade broth, the same philosophy applies to beef bones, which most American butchers will hand over for free or nearly free if you simply ask. Roast them for about 40 minutes until deeply browned, then simmer for 6 to 8 hours with ginger, scallion, and a splash of soy sauce. What comes out is a rich, beefy broth that replaces every carton of store-bought stock sitting in your pantry and costs next to nothing to make. It freezes the same way as the tallow, ready in cube form whenever a soup or pan sauce needs it. Habit 14. Sunday prep bags divide sliced beef into 8-ounce portions. Each in its own bag with a different marinade soy and ginger for one, shio koji for another, onion marinade for a third. Press each bag flat, squeeze out the air, and freeze them stacked. Thaw one in cool water for 20 minutes on a busy weeknight, and dinner is ready before you've had time to think about ordering out. 6 bags prepped on a Sunday afternoon means 6 dinners already handled before the week even starts. Habit 15. Giving leftovers a second life. Leftover steak is never wasted either. Cold sliced beef tossed with a light dressing becomes lunch. Chopped and simmered with soy, mirin, and sugar, it becomes a savory topping that turns a plain bowl of rice into dinner. Poured over hot rice with warm broth, it becomes an entirely new meal quick, comforting, and built from something that would otherwise sit forgotten at the back of the fridge. There's something worth saying before we wrap up. Every technique here takes a small amount of prep time up front, usually about an hour on a Sunday afternoon. If that hour isn't available, most of these savings won't follow. This approach runs on a little preparation, and the easy weeknight dinners it produces are only easy because the work was already done a few days earlier. It's also worth being honest about the dry aging habit. Aging beef in a home fridge for 4 or 5 days is a genuine improvement in flavor and tenderness, but it isn't the same as commercial 30-day dry aging, which develops a completely different depth of flavor and needs more controlled conditions than a home fridge can offer. If you love that deep, funky character of a proper aged steak, home aging won't fully replace it, but it gets you most of the way there for none of the cost. Here's the bigger picture. A steak was never meant to be one meal for one person. Decades of restaurant portioning and marketing have trained us to think a proper steak dinner means one full slab of beef on one plate for one adult, with the entire price riding on that single dinner. But the same piece of beef can just as easily be the beginning of something 4 times as large a small pile of concentrated protein and fat that stretches across a family of 4, with fat left over for tomorrow morning. None of this was really about finding cheaper beef. It was about asking more of the beef you already buy. Start with just 3 of these habits this week: the evening markdown trip between 6 and 8 p.m., the cross-grain slicing on the largest board you own, and one tenderizing marinade on the cheapest cut you can find. By the end of the month, you'll notice the difference both in your grocery bill and in what comes off your stove.